He chose the mistress and left his son in the hospital, but life made him pay. She believed nothing could hurt more than watching her husband turn his back on their child at one of the most fragile moments of their lives. While the baby fought a serious illness in the hospital, he chose to spend his time and money with his mistress. But what seemed like just another story of abandonment turned into a shocking twist when the child's grandfather, outraged by his own son's neglect, decided to step in. No one expected that after his death, a will revealed in the middle of a family meeting would forever change the fate of that mother, the child, and the entire company built with so much effort. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The metallic chill of St. Helen Children's Hospital in Boston seemed to seep through even the toughest skin. White walls, corridors lit by harsh fluorescent lights, and the constant beeping of monitors created an atmosphere where time felt frozen. Sitting in a chair that had already molded to her body after so many long hours, Claire held the tiny hand of her 6-month-old son, Ethan. The baby was hooked up to wires, tubes, and machines that blinked without pause, every signal on the monitor both a relief and a torment. The diagnosis of severe congenital heart disease had fallen on her like a crushing sentence. The surgery had been postponed as long as possible, but now the doctors were clear. Without intervention, he wouldn't survive much longer. Exhausted as she was, Claire never left his side, whispering promises he couldn't yet understand, but that kept her on her feet. While Claire fought for every breath her baby took, her husband, Michael Carter, lived in another universe. CEO of Carter Communications, one of the most influential media companies in the country, he justified his absence with a packed schedule of meetings, investor dinners, and trips to secure partnerships. In reality, many of those nights were spent with his mistress, an ambitious assistant with whom he flaunted a life of luxury. For him, the hospital represented defeat and vulnerability, something that didn't fit the image of the unstoppable executive he cultivated. While Claire grabbed quick meals from the hospital cafeteria, he dined in Manhattan's finest restaurants, surrounded by expensive wine glasses, far from the antiseptic smell that clung to his wife. The contrast between their worlds grew more brutal each day. Claire woke to the alarms of the ICU, joined doctors in complex discussions about treatment protocols, and tried to decipher graphs filled with numbers. Michael woke in 5-star hotels, answering messages on a phone that never stopped buzzing. His justifications always came in a condescending tone, as if explaining the impossible to a child. We can't risk the company's cash flow. The surgery is expensive, but insurance will cover part of it. You just need to be patient. But patience was a luxury Claire didn't have, because Ethan's heart was running out of time. Each minute made the baby weaker, and she felt she was fighting against the clock alone in her brief moments of rest. Claire called her parents, who lived in a small town in rural Vermont. They offered emotional support, but distance and limited means kept them from helping financially. Michael's father, Richard Carter, was the only one in his family who showed genuine concern. Despite his own declining health, he called almost every day to ask about Ethan. The conversations were short, but filled with real worry. How did he sleep last night? What did the doctors say today? The patriarch's deep voice stood in stark contrast to his son's coldness, and it became one of Claire's few lifelines. She sensed, even without knowing details, that the grandfather saw in Ethan something the father refused to acknowledge. The continuation of the family. The hours in the hospital were grueling, yet Claire refused to leave her post. Many nights she fell asleep with her head resting against the side of the incubator, jerking awake at the slightest change in the monitors. The nurses already knew her by name and admired her strength, though they also recognized the toll it was taking. The deep circles under her eyes, the trembling hands, the frailness that revealed missed meals and constant stress. Still, She made it a point to attend every exam and every meeting with the specialists, asking questions and filling page after page of her notebook with scribbled notes. What kept her going wasn't trust in her husband. It was the certainty that only she could truly fight for her son. Across town, Michael ignored Claire's calls while smiling at social events, raising champagne glasses and making promises to potential business partners. His world revolved around appearances, and admitting his son needed an expensive, risky treatment would mean exposing weakness. For him, that image was unacceptable. Claire, on the other hand, wasn't afraid of fragility. She lived immersed in it every single day, just by looking at Ethan. And in that I see you chair, even in solitude, she silently vowed she would move heaven and earth. But she would never allow her child to be forgotten because of a father who chose the glitter of the spotlight over the soft breath of a baby fighting for his life. The next morning, Claire was called to a meeting with the medical team. Dr. Hamilton, the pediatric cardiologist in charge of Ethan's case, explained firmly that there could be no further delays. The corrective surgery had to be done within days, but there were expenses the insurance wouldn't cover. The amount was substantial, involving not only the specialized surgical team, but also the intensive post-operative care, ongoing medication, and follow-up treatments. Claire gripped her pen tightly, trying to take notes, though her mind spun with the pressing question: how would she ever come up with the money? Leaving the room, she stopped in front of the glass panel that separated the ICU from the corridor and looked at her sleeping son. His small body, connected to wires and machines, made her chest ache even more. She took a deep breath, determined to confront Michael and lay bare the urgency of the situation. By early afternoon, Claire finally managed to reach him on the phone. The background noise of clinking cutlery and lively voices betrayed that he was at a restaurant, not in a meeting as he had claimed earlier. "Michael, we need to talk seriously." Dr. Hamilton was clear. The surgery has to be done soon. "We don't have time," she said, her voice breaking. On the other end, he sighed impatiently, as if dealing with an annoying demand. "Claire, I already told you it's not that simple. We've got audits going on at the company, and any sudden movement of funds could compromise the reports. I'll look into it carefully." His answer built a wall between them. Claire insisted, stressing the imminent risk, but the call abruptly dropped. He didn't call back. What remained was the crushing sense of abandonment, the certainty that their son's life wasn't his priority. Moments later, Claire was startled by the unexpected arrival of Richard Carter at the hospital. Her father-in-law came in with the help of a nurse, visibly tired, but his eyes immediately sought out his grandson. Slowly, he approached Ethan's bed, watching the tiny chest rise and fall with effort. He stood in silence for a few seconds until Claire, weighed down by everything she'd been holding back, finally let it spill out. "He needs the surgery right away, Richard. The doctor said we can't wait any longer. Insurance covers part of it, but the rest..." Michael hasn't released a dime. The words came out with difficulty, but they were the raw truth she could no longer contain. Richard took a while to answer. He rubbed his face, as though he needed time to organize his thoughts. When he finally looked up at Claire, his expression wasn't just worried, it was stunned. "Are you telling me my son refused to pay for his own child's surgery?" His voice was deep, his tone sharp. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she nodded. "I didn't want to burden you. I know your health needs attention too, but I can't pretend anymore. I'm alone in this fight." Her words hummed heavily in the air. Richard drew a long breath, stepped closer to the incubator, and slowly shook his head. "Claire, if I had known this before, I would have taken care of it immediately. Don't worry. I'll make sure Ethan has his surgery as soon as possible." "You have my word," he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. His tone carried firmness, but also a weight that revealed how serious this revelation was. Claire felt a wave of relief, as though someone had finally stepped in to stand beside her. At the same time, fear lingered. She knew her father-in-law's physical limits. Still, hearing that someone truly cared and was willing to act reignited her strength. Their conversation stretched on. Claire shared in detail everything Dr. Hamilton had explained earlier that morning. The urgency, the short timeline, the need for specialized medications, the ongoing care required. Richard listened intently, never interrupting, absorbing every word. His expression was somber, but each piece of information only seemed to strengthen his resolve. "You are not alone, Claire. I'll take care of this," he repeated before stepping away. His slow gait betrayed his frailty, but his eyes burned with determination, the kind of determination that wouldn't let his grandson be left unprotected. Back in her chair, Claire clasped Ethan's hand and let a few tears slip quietly down her face. The image of her father-in-law promising help echoed in her mind, sparking a flame of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, she felt that someone else grasped the gravity of the situation as clearly as she did. She gazed at her sleeping son, his breathing guided by the machines, and whispered, "Your grandfather said he'll help us. And I believe him." The steady rhythm of the monitors filled the room, but inside her, the emptiness felt just a little less suffocating. The following week began with small but noticeable changes in routine. Claire realized that some conversations at the hospital moved more quickly after Richard's visit. Dr. Hamilton mentioned that he had received calls regarding Ethan's case being given priority, and although he didn't say from whom, she knew where the effort was coming from. Her father-in-law seemed to be keeping his promise quietly, reaching out to contacts and applying pressure to make sure his grandson had immediate access to everything he needed. Claire found herself sleeping a little more, still curled up in the ICU chair, but now with the comfort of knowing she wasn't carrying everything alone. In those days, she avoided calling Michael. She no longer expected anything from him. Her focus was solely on Ethan and the renewed hope Richard's support had given her. In the early hours of Tuesday morning, Claire's phone rang inside the hospital. It was Richard's personal assistant. Her trembling voice delivered the news Claire had dreaded. Richard had suffered a heart attack at home and hadn't survived. The confirmation struck Claire like a physical blow. She sat down at once, trying to process it, but the weight of the information bent her forward. In the still corridor, the echo of the news felt bigger than the space itself. The one man who had given her real promises of help was gone, suddenly, without goodbyes, leaving her uncertain of what he had managed to resolve before his death. The hospital suddenly felt colder, emptier. That same morning, Michael arrived at the hospital, not for Ethan, but to speak briefly with Claire about his father's funeral arrangements. He was immaculate in a dark suit, his expression controlled, but with a glimmer in his eyes Claire recognized. It wasn't grief. It was calculation. "The board will be meeting soon, and I need you to be aware that we'll have a lot of work ahead," he said in a detached, almost bureaucratic tone. He didn't ask about Ethan, didn't want to hear about the surgery. For Michael, his father's death was a chance to consolidate power, and every gesture made that clear. Claire, too drained to confront him, remained silent, watching the coldness of a man who no longer belonged in her fight. Meanwhile, Ethan's condition reached a critical point. Dr. Hamilton called Claire into yet another emergency meeting. "We can't wait any longer. The surgery must be done now, even without the financial guarantees in place. We'll deal with the administrative issues later." Claire felt her legs go weak. The thought was terrifying, yet it also came as a relief. Finally, they would move forward. The doctor explained the risks, detailed the complexity of the procedure, and asked her to sign the formal consents. With trembling hands, Claire signed every document, fully aware the debt would be immense, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that Ethan was being given a chance. The preparation was swift. Nurses and doctors moved in and out of the room, adjusting equipment, prepping medications, and explaining the surgical logistics. Claire kissed her son's forehead before he was wheeled away to the operating room, her heart tighter than ever. She stood in the corridor, watching the team disappear until the doors closed. Alone, she leaned against the cold wall and let her tears flow freely. Her thoughts turned to Richard and the promise he had made. Even in death, it was as if his efforts had cleared the path that allowed the medical team to act without further delay. Claire knew, in some way, her father-in-law was still standing beside his grandson. Richard's funeral took place 2 days later, while Ethan was still recovering from surgery. Claire attended only the wake, staying for just a few hours, torn between her grief and the need to return to the hospital. Michael, on the other hand, took charge of the ceremony with carefully crafted speeches, praising his father's greatness and the continuation of the Carter Empire. His widow, Eleanor, remained silent, visibly shaken, but refraining from interfering. The contrast between genuine sorrow and ambition disguised as mourning was glaring. As Claire slipped out quietly, she felt something greater was about to unfold. She didn't yet know that Richard's final words had already been sealed, ready to change the fate of everyone at the reading of his will. The boardroom at Carter Media's headquarters in downtown Boston carried a weight of its own that overcast morning. Dark wood-paneled walls and a sweeping glass window framing the skyline gave the place a solemn, almost intimidating atmosphere. Claire sat at one end of the table, her fingers clasped in her lap, aware that her presence there was more the result of Richard's explicit request before his death than of her own choosing. Michael sat in the center, his tailored suit perfect, his gestures precise, as though this were just another business meeting. His mother, Eleanor, sat quietly beside him, her reddened eyes betraying her grief, though her posture remained dignified. The other seats were filled with company directors and 2 of Richard's trusted attorneys. The room held a restrained tension, everyone waiting for the formal reading that would decide the future of a multi-billion-dollar empire. For Claire, however, none of it had any shine. Her thoughts were still at the hospital, in the room where Ethan was recovering from risky surgery, each of his breaths a hard-won victory. The lead attorney, Charles Whitmore, a tall man with silver hair and a steady voice, opened his folder and cleared his throat before beginning. The sound of unfolding paper echoed through the room, and the silence that followed was absolute. "We are gathered here to carry out the last wishes of Mr. Richard Carter, recorded in his will and validated in court only days before his passing." Michael shifted in his chair, his eyes glinting with anticipation. Claire noticed the faint smile he tried to hide, as though he already knew the outcome. Charles continued, "Mr. Carter believed that a family's legacy should not be measured only by wealth, but by how it protects those it claims as its own." The statement made Michael roll his eyes discreetly, but it sent a chill down Claire's spine. She had always known Richard's values were different from his son's, but she never expected that contrast to be laid bare at the very start. As the reading went on, Michael's patience wore thin. He wanted to hear about percentages, shares, properties, but Charles moved slowly through Richard's declarations of principle. Then the first blow landed. After observing serious negligence in my son's conduct, both within the family and the company, I decided to alter earlier provisions of this will. I find it unacceptable that someone who fails to honor his own family should be entrusted with the fortune I built throughout my life. A murmur swept the room, and Michael leaned forward, his face tense with disbelief. Claire held her breath. The attorney calmly pulled out an auxiliary folder and laid out supporting documents. Independent audits confirmed misappropriations, including funds diverted from the corporate health reserve money created to cover medical emergencies for employees and their families. Funds that should have been available for the treatment of young Ethan Carter. Claire's heart raced. This was the truth she had suspected, now made public, undeniable before everyone present. Michael shot to his feet, his voice rising. "This is a lie. My father was weak, manipulated by someone who wanted to see me ruined." But Charles didn't flinch. "Mr. Carter, all the documents were reviewed and authenticated. There is no margin for doubt." Richard acted with full mental capacity, aware of every detail. Eleanor, silent until then, closed her eyes as if the words only confirmed what she had already known in her heart. Several directors exchanged uneasy glances. Many had seen Michael's questionable behavior, but never imagined the patriarch would cut his son off so decisively. Claire stayed still, but inside, anger and relief intertwined. At last, someone was saying out loud what she had lived through alone. Her son's life had been neglected by his own father for the sake of pleasure and appearances. Charles pressed on, his tone formal and unwavering. "Based on this, I declare that my son, Michael Carter, is disinherited from all family assets, including shares, real estate, and any resource tied to my name or Carter Media. He shall not inherit a single cent." Silence gripped the room, as if the air itself had been sucked away. Michael, pale, clutched the table, unable to process what he had just heard. One of the assistant attorneys slid a copy of the will toward him, but the words were already seared into his mind like a fatal blow. Claire lowered her eyes, her heart heavy, yet a sense of justice washed over her. Richard was gone, but he had ensured that injustice would not prevail. Finally, Charles delivered the closing clause, every word weighing like lead. "The entirety of my estate shall be placed in an irrevocable trust, with one sole beneficiary, my grandson, Ethan Carter. This trust shall cover all his medical expenses, education, and well-being until adulthood, under the exclusive administration of his mother, Claire Evans." Tears filled Claire's eyes. It wasn't just financial relief, it was validation of her fight, proof that someone saw her child as the priority he was. Michael, desperate, tried to lash out once more. "This is illegal. I'll contest it." Charles raised his hand firmly. "Your father foresaw that. He included a no-contest clause. Any attempt to challenge this will result in Carter Media's immediate liquidation, with all proceeds donated to Boston Children's Hospital. There is no room for maneuver, Mr. Carter." The room fell silent again. Michael slumped into his chair, defeated. Claire's hands trembled as she realized this was more than just a legal decision. It was the start of a new life, for Ethan and for her. The reading of the will still echoed in Claire's mind as she stepped out of Carter Media's headquarters that frigid Boston morning. The wind cut across her skin, sharp and cold, yet it felt lighter than the storm of emotions stirring inside her. Relief was there, of course, but so was a strange blend of apprehension and responsibility. She knew the fortune secured for Ethan would guarantee the care and safety her son deserved. Yet it also placed her in an unexpected position, the steward of a legacy not hers by blood, but by trust. She left the building with hurried steps, eager to return to the hospital and see her child. Just as she reached the corner, a firm voice stopped her. "Claire, may we talk?" It was Eleanor Carter, her mother-in-law, a woman who had always kept her distance cool and restrained. But now, her expression carried an unfamiliar softness. Claire hesitated for a moment before agreeing. They walked to a quiet cafe near the hospital, its warmth filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and polished wood. Claire remained silent for the first few minutes, waiting for Eleanor to speak. Dressed in a tailored gray coat, Eleanor held her cup with steady hands, though her eyes betrayed deep emotion. "I know what happened today was a shock for everyone, especially for you," she began, her voice low but controlled. "Richard made changes even I didn't anticipate, but I want you to know he did not leave me unprotected. The home, the private assets we shared, the income he always ensured, those remain mine. He was careful. He thought of me too. Claire let out a quiet breath, absorbing the words. She felt a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying ease from her shoulders. She would not have to bear the guilt of taking something away from Eleanor. Sensing this, Eleanor quickly added, "You don't need to worry about me, my dear." What Richard did was right. He broke a cycle that could have destroyed this family. The statement caught Claire off guard. She hadn't expected validation to come from the woman who'd spent a lifetime by Michael's side. Eleanor sipped her coffee, then set the cup back onto its saucer with deliberate care. "I love my son, Claire. Don't misunderstand that. But loving him doesn't mean closing my eyes to what he has become." Richard saw early that Michael had lost his sense of responsibility, and I lacked the courage to confront him. Perhaps it was cowardice or maybe convenience, but I ignored signs that later became impossible to overlook. Richard didn't leave the inheritance to Ethan out of kindness alone. It was also an act of correction, a final attempt to save our family's legacy from Michael's selfishness. Her voice faltered briefly, and Claire noticed a subtle tremor in her hands, a rare crack in the armor of a woman who had always seemed unyielding. Carefully, Claire spoke. "I don't want you to think I had any influence in his decision. I never asked for anything for me or for Ethan. I only wanted my son to have a chance." Eleanor nodded slowly, a faint smile appearing on her lips. "I know that. And that's exactly why Richard trusted you. He knew your heart wasn't chasing power. It was protecting your child. That purity of purpose is what Michael lacked." The words sank deep into Claire's heart, as though someone finally saw her clearly. For months, she had been treated as a burden by her husband, her pleas for their son dismissed as inconvenient. Hearing Eleanor recognize her fight and affirm Richard's trust was an unexpected relief. The conversation unfolded with surprising openness. Eleanor spoke of the burden of being Richard's wife, of a family that had long placed business above feelings, and of the regret of not intervening sooner in Michael's behavior. "But we can't change the past," she concluded, locking eyes with Claire. "What we can do is protect the future. And now, that future is in your hands." Claire tightened her grip on her cup, the weight of responsibility pressing against her chest. "I will do everything I can to honor that trust," she replied firmly. Eleanor smiled faintly, perhaps the first genuine smile Claire had ever seen on her face. "I believe you." And in a way, Richard believed it too. That is the greatest proof of all. When they left the cafe, walking side by side toward the parking lot, Claire realized something had shifted between them. They were no longer just mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, separated by opposing sides of a fractured family. There was now a kind of quiet alliance, a shared understanding that could help hold together what remained of the Carters. As they parted, Eleanor held Claire's hand for a moment longer, her tone carrying a rare warmth. "Take care of my grandson, Claire. He's the future of all of us." Claire nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She returned to the hospital that afternoon with a new feeling in her chest. It wasn't only hope, it was the certainty that even amid the ruin Michael had caused, there were still bonds strong enough to rebuild from. 5 years had passed since that night when Claire had walked the hospital corridors with her heart in pieces. Now, as she watched Ethan running through the garden with his school backpack still on his shoulders, it felt almost unreal to think of everything they had endured. His rosy cheeks and wide smile were proof that life could bloom again after the storm. He still had periodic checkups, but the doctors all agreed that his health was strong, that he could play, study, and grow like any other child. Claire followed his every move with pride, whether it was a colorful drawing brought home from class or the excitement in his voice as he recounted the soccer game during recess. She knew each detail was a victory. Deep inside, the memories of anguish still lingered, a reminder of how close they had come to losing this future. Each of his laughs was a confirmation that her courage to stand against Michael's neglect had been worth every tear shed. Her professional life had transformed just as completely. Claire had taken the reins of Carter Media with the firmness many had doubted she possessed. The first board meetings had been clouded with skepticism, but she learned to respond with clarity, data, and a calm resolve that dismantled every attempt to undermine her. Over the course of 5 years, she expanded the company's reach into digital platforms, launched social communication initiatives, and strengthened its reputation, honoring Richard's legacy while adding her own vision. Employees who once dismissed her as the widow of the heir now spoke of her as their leader, a model of dedication and balance. At the end of each workday, as she stacked reports neatly on her desk, Claire reminded herself that she wasn't working only for her own success, but for the son waiting at home, for the mother-in-law who trusted her, and for the legacy Richard had left as an act of love and faith. Eleanor, once a distant and formal presence, had become a daily ally. She moved closer to Claire's home and, from then on, shared not only Ethan's care, but also genuine moments of companionship. Together, they spent afternoons reviewing his schoolwork, walked side by side in the garden discussing the day's news, and on special dates, remembered Richard with words of gratitude. Eleanor never stopped repeating that her husband had done the right thing by entrusting the family's future to Claire, and those words gave strength on the days when the responsibilities felt heavy. Their bond grew so solid that many saw them almost as mother and daughter, united by a love born of daily life and by the conviction that together they had carried Ethan forward and preserved everything Richard had once dreamed for him. Michael, on the other hand, remained on the margins of what he had lost. Stripped of his position in the company, he had not taken on any meaningful role since the will had been read, and his presence in public life had nearly vanished. All that remained were his court-order visits with his son. On those occasions, he arrived on time, often with small gifts hastily chosen, trying to build a closeness that never fully took root. Ethan, with a child's innocence, welcomed him kindly, telling stories about school and showing his drawings. But the bond was shallow, nothing like the connection he shared with Claire or his grandmother. Michael avoided conflict, respected the boundaries, and kept his exchanges with Claire brief and polite. At times, he spoke longer with his mother, confessing regrets and lamenting the choices that had left him isolated. Eleanor listened patiently, but never failed to remind him that it had been Claire who held the family together when everything was on the line. For Claire, watching this dynamic demanded balance. She harbored neither bitterness nor illusions. She knew Michael lived with his guilt and accepted that Ethan had the right to know his father, but she drew clear lines to keep her son safe. She no longer feared losing her footing. She had built her own secure ground. She managed the company, ran the household, protected Ethan's health, and carved out time for moments of peace. Her life wasn't simple, but it was steady, and that steadiness was priceless. Over time, she came to realize that happiness didn't require perfection. It required the essentials: love, safety, and dignity. Watching Ethan play, she felt reassured that her fight had reshaped their destiny, even if the scars of the past could never be erased. 5 years later, the Carter family was not what it once had been, but it had found a new balance. Ethan was growing strong, surrounded by love and stories that one day he would understand more fully. Eleanor remained by his side, both grandmother and steadfast friend. Claire stood as the firm leader who carried the company's legacy and her son's future. Michael, confined to his limited role, lingered as a reminder of mistakes that could not be undone, but also as proof that Ethan still had a father, even if from a distance. There were no fairy tale endings, only a reality rebuilt into something stronger, shaped by resilience and courage. And with that certainty, Claire could finally breathe with the calm of someone who knew she had done everything within her power. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.